Good evening and welcome to today's session on BIC Streams, Insurgent Empire, How Rebellious Colonies Changed British Attitudes to Empire. Joining us today are Priyamvada Gopal, who will be in conversation with Salil Tripathi. Welcome everyone. Before I hand over to Salil, a few quick announcements. For those of you who are here for the first time and would like to sign up to our mailing list, you can do so by visiting our website. You can also follow us on our social media channels, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. With that, over to you, Salil.
Thank you so much, Raghu, and very warm and welcome to Priya. She is in the afternoon in Cambridge. I'm in my morning in New York, and many of you are listening in the evening in Bangalore and elsewhere in the world. So good day to everybody. I won't introduce Priya because, as Raghu said, there will be the bios in the chat box, but to anyone familiar with writing, with commentary, with challenging and analyzing the way we are and the way we were and the way we will be, Priya's contribution has been enormous, either through her public discourses, her book, her writing, her comments, and lately in social media. And there's a lot we can cover. We can go on and we can even talk about cats, which will keep us busy for hours and hours. But that's not the topic of the day. We are going to talk about something fairly serious, which matters about what happened in the past and what's happening today, and what will be our fate as we go along. And given the Black Lives Matter movement, there are lots of extremely interesting themes to cover. So we'll do our best. We have an hour. We may go more. I mean, we can go on forever, but we'll go when Raghu finally cuts us off. Past is a foreign country, and there are prevailing myths on how colonization has ended. I grew up in India, and we know the whole story of non-violence and civil disobedience as a way of dealing with the empire, Gandhi being the icon of that movement, but many others following him. And the story we have heard about is always a decent and graceful British people who decide to live as friends, and India remaining in the Commonwealth was a major achievement that everyone was very proud of. Jallianwala Bagh and General Dyer are the exceptions, and Churchill and what happened in Bengal in the famine is seen as a bad apple, a moment in the life of a great hero. We got cricket, we got judiciary, we got the parliament, we got the English language in which we are speaking now, and we got the railways. And you know, as Salman Rushdie wrote about in Midnight Children, on 15th August 1947, a lot of brown people overnight turned white. So that's the kind of syndrome we have had. But then in your book, Priya, you talk about the Caliban model and you challenge it a little, in which the slave is supposed to denounce slavery using the master's language and reinforcing what ultimately is a Whig history, as you put it, you know, in which the British Empire wants to claim credit for its own dissolution, that it was nice, it was waiting for the right moment, the white man's burden, as Kipling would put it in the Philippine context. And that myth was choking. You know, C.L.R. James you cite often, and you know, he was upset about it. And this whole idea of remaking imperial relations was constantly thwarted by the inability of the class, the colonial class, to think that there were people who had their own agency and they were demanding rights and were not to be given privileges. And the term that you use is reverse tutelage, that the imperial tutelage of one idea of looking at it, but it misses not only the anti-colonial resistance, but how the anti-colonial resistance ends up shaping thinking in the metropolitan elite in England. So it's a fascinating inquiry. You go into it from literary history and literature and history. So how did the societies change? And you know, I mean, as we come forward, and you know, and I lived in Britain for 20 years till last year, and the Windrush scandal was a very good example of that. The Brexit debate is part of that. Whole Little England movement is part of that. And the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, all of that feeds into that. And it has echoes in India too. I mean, I'm just presaging what we're going to talk today. In Ahmedabad, I'm writing a book on Gujaratis, and I was in Ahmedabad about 2 years ago where I saw posters saying, what about Brahmins' rights? You know, that Brahmins also have rights. So in that context, and reflecting on what Macaulay once said, that it is to peculiar, this is what you quoted, it is to her peculiar glory, not that she has ruled so widely, not that she has conquered so splendidly, but she has ruled only to bless and conquered to spare. Is that a fair accounting of your concern? Would you like to unpack some of these themes?
Thank you, Salil. Thank you for sharing this, and thank you to the BIC for hosting this discussion. And thank you to those of you listening. Yes, that's a very admirably pithy overview of the book. I did want to challenge the mythology, which I think is very deeply rooted in Britain, but also in I think some of the former colonies, that the transition from colonial rule to post-colonial nationhood was relatively smooth, that it basically involved the transfer of power from one set of elites to another once the country was deemed ready to receive independence. This is very beloved, as you know, in the British context. The idea that empire was a kind of very thought through, planned, benevolent enterprise, at the end of which colonies were given, and I use given in quotation marks, their independence because now they were ready to graduate, as it were, from empire school. And the idea of the Commonwealth is very much based still on that notion that these are graduated countries. These are countries who went through the schooling that was provided by the empire, and now they are grown up. They can be independent, but they will always continue to have a special relationship with Britain, with the Queen, and then subsequently, of course, Prince Charles, when he takes over the crown, heading the Commonwealth. So this idea is very much, I think, enshrined in global political discourse, that there are special relationships that the colonies, former colonies, have with Britain, and that the Commonwealth is a continuing live and productive form of association that will replace Europe in 2021 when Brexit finally kicks in. And I think that, as you suggested, this myth of a benevolent empire which taught its colonies how to be free is very deeply rooted in Britain. It's not in the past. It very much influences contemporary foreign policy, contemporary political decisions, and in that sense has a certain weight that does need to be challenged. And that was kind of the impetus in writing this book, is to kind of challenge that particular mythology, which continues to be operative.
And there has been resistance, right? I mean, when you raise this point, people always say, yes, but this is still, these are the margins of history. I mean, this whole movement against statues that we see, people say, yes, but we have to look at the overall contribution, even with someone as despicable as this man Colston, whose statue was taken down in Bristol because he built schools and hospitals, you know, so that kind of, I mean, if he did, I mean, it is his trust probably which did it and maintains it. But I mean, it's kind of this compensation of costs and benefit, balancing act, that still governs a lot. That yes, Dyer behaved badly, Churchill behaved badly, but we gave you the parliament and you are messing it up now. I mean, there is that view around it, which is problematic. And of course, Macaulay, we keep going back to, you know, his famous statement about, you know, one library in English is better than all the collective literatures of the world, and, you know, creating this class of people who are, you know, who are
interpreters,
but babus, but who are going to administer the empire. So, and that still very much remains at the heart. And and you later, I'm not jumping the argument forward, but you do talk about the radical politics of in Britain. You know, you talk. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, of course, comes into it, but even for Lord Fenner Brockway and all of, and the Labour Party from Keir Hardie's visit. But at the same time, when you talk about Hardie's visit and Ramsay MacDonald's visit, you talk about Aurobindo Ghosh being very skeptical of what the British elite can do. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's important to understand that wherever you look, whether you look at Kenya or India or the, you know, the Caribbean islands, the West Indies as we know them today, resistance to empire was always a very complicated picture. So there were always people who were kind of moderates, who kind of wanted to collaborate with the British but get a few rights. You know, large sections of the Indian National Congress were not necessarily anti-colonial in a radical sense, they wanted rights for Indian elites. They were fine with British rule. They wanted rights for Indian elites. But the Indian National Congress had both a right wing and a left wing, as well as a center. There were people who wanted to collaborate and have a kind of gentle reformist relationship with Britain. There were people, and Aurobindo Ghosh was one of them at one end, as was, of course, Tilak, who were much more against the empire itself. So, and the same thing you can see in places like Kenya. There are people, in fact, like Kenyatta, who were largely just reformists. They were kind of constitutional agitators. And then there were people who eventually became the Mau Mau movement, who were fed up with constitutional agitation, yielding very, very little, and decided to turn, as in that case, to guerrilla warfare, to resistance from the forests. So the map of dissidence on the question of empire, resistance to empire, is never a kind of monolithic picture. In India, I think we have more or less completely tied it up with Gandhi. And although, of course, Gandhi was a very central part of the story, he was not the only part of the story in India. The Congress itself had a lot of fractures on the question of how the empire could or should be resisted. But of course, there were people who were not in the Congress who sought either to, take up more violent forms of insurgency. And there were, of course, also communists who were much more invested in labor rebellions, trade unions, workers' actions. So I think what I wanted to partly begin to do in the book, which other historians have done, is to complicate the picture of resistance to empire and say it's never only one story. There are multiple stories in the question of resistance to the empire. And the other thing that you point to that I think was important to the book, just as India or Kenya were not homogeneous and single stories, the picture in Britain was also not homogeneous. We think about Britain as represented by Churchill or represented by Disraeli in the 19th century. But any society, whether it's India today or Britain today, is not a kind of simple monolithic picture. There was a lot of dissent on the question of empire in Britain. Not everybody thought that the British Raj was a great thing. Not everybody thought that slavery was okay. There was a lot of argumentation around, the several hundred years of British imperial rule. And I also wanted to draw out that picture of dissidence and establish, moreover, that there was a relationship between dissidents in Britain and dissidents in the colonies. And that's really what the book tries to do, is to try to establish what that particular relationship was.
And the other interesting thing I find is, where you do write about Edmund Burke and his criticism of the East India Company, and you write about some of those arguments, which is interesting, that Indians hated East India Company for reason X, and Burke hated it for a different reason, which was the values that those people who behaved incredibly badly in the colonies, what they would bring back to the center, as it were. And I think that's very interesting that so someone from a left perspective and someone from a right perspective, both may have an opposition to what the company was doing in India, but the starting points are different, though their end goal may be the same. I mean, that was very interesting that came through in the book. But I wanted to stay with the Gandhi and the India-Kenya, and I accept completely that, there were many ways of going towards independence in the countries, and question whether it's India or Kenya. But there is this idea of Indian exceptionalism, because there is a Malayan. I lived in Singapore for some time, so I'm very familiar with what happened in the Malayan insurgents in the 50s and the emergency rules that were imposed at that time. And we know South Africa, where Mandela starts out as a non-violent activist, and then of course ends up defending violence. In his famous speech at the time of the Rivonia trial, he says what he has to say. And then you have Mau Mau, which again does choose the path of. So is this Indian exceptionalism argument that makes, in a way, falls apart, because that argument is that if the Portuguese or the Germans or the Japanese had colonized, Gandhi would have been arrested and killed within 5 minutes, and there would have been a different independent story. But Britain was different. But if Britain was really different, it wasn't that different compared to other empires in other parts of the world. So can you unpack that a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Britain, the story always has been that we weren't as bad as the French
Yes.
and the Belgians. And that only holds up if you go along with the story of the so-called transfer of power, right? So the transfer of power narrative of independence is that the British elites worked well with Nehru, Gandhi, and others, and then they just handed power over when India was ready for it. Now, even the Indian story, for one thing, it has dominated the picture of anti-colonialism at the expense of equally important rebellions in the West Indies and in parts of British Africa, West and East Africa, where it was a quite a different story. But the thing is that even within the story of India, Gandhi's non-violence is often also flattened out rather more than it ought to be. Gandhi didn't always necessarily take an unambiguous position on non-violence. He was personally non-violent. He had a personal commitment to ahimsa, but he was forced to recognize, like it or not, that people like Bhagat Singh were on the wider picture and that they had a huge following. That in fact, the martyrdom of the Shaheed Bhagat Singh and others was not something that the Congress could distance itself from unambiguously. So when he talks about Bhagat Singh, for instance, he says, yes, these are people who were misguided, they did it differently, but their sacrifice is one that we must acknowledge and accept. So we must, and Kama MacLean, the Australian historian, has written about, Bhagat Singh and the Hindustan Socialist Revolutionary Army very beautifully to say that, they put pressure on the Congress. The Congress was not a kind of monolithic Gandhian outfit, that the Congress had to engage on the one hand with the question of revolutionary violence, and on the other hand with trade union rebellions, and worker movements and things that Gandhi didn't necessarily approve of or authorize directly, but he had to acknowledge that other forms of resistance were taking place. Yeah. The story of Indian independence is acquired solely through non-violence, I think does need to be complicated. It has been complicated by historians. But we also need to be aware that Gandhi could not be, and Nehru, of course, could not be isolated from the other kinds of resistance that were taking place. And at some level, they had to acknowledge its reality. And one very good example that I do write about is the Meerut conspiracy case, right? In 1929, 31 people, including 3 Englishmen, are arrested and charged with conspiracy against the King Emperor, with conspiracy to deprive the King Emperor of sovereignty. That was section 121A, which remains on the books with slightly different wording, and that's a slightly different story.
And not under the same section, but in the similar sections, we have poets like Varavara Rao going to jail.
Yeah, I mean, we have not really changed the penal code given to us by the British in anything like sufficient post-colonial detail. We do use colonial era laws, and that is something I think we do have to think about, much more sharply than perhaps we do. But to return to the Meerut conspiracy case, what is important here is that Langford, the prosecutor, actually uses this to try to drive a wedge between Congress nationalists and communists, right? So he points out that he's absolutely okay with Gandhi. He's absolutely okay with Congress mainstream nationalism. It's the communists that he's against. But in fact, neither Gandhi nor Nehru fall for this. Both of them condemn the taking of the prisoners and the treatment of the prisoners fairly unambiguously. Nehru points out, for instance, that communism is a charge that is used to, cover a multiplicity of sins, and that it is in a sense a meaningless charge. And they do, in a certain limited way, come to the defense and speak out in support of the Meerut conspiracy prisoners. Now, I point to this by way of saying that, again, the picture of resistance in India, particularly in the 1920s, when strikes and labor rebellions are absolutely endemic, that, you know, again, this is a more complicated picture than just the story of Gandhi, ahimsa, and civil disobedience would lead us to suggest.
Yeah, I want to switch back to Britain a little bit because I think one of your, the thesis from which I learned a lot, in fact, that's the central point of the book, and which I find fascinating, is how the colonial struggle itself changed Britain, and, you know, the politics within Britain and the tradition, and how, where it was effective and where it wasn't effective, because there are times where there are limits to how much can be done, even if it's Lord Brockway, and, you know, you are skeptical about how much was it, I mean, how much was his movement within the parliament as effective as he himself believed it to be, for Africa particularly. So can you speak a little bit about that, about how Britain itself changed?
Yeah, you know, in Britain, the mythology that I talked about at the beginning of our discussion, that, you know, empire was always a plan to give people their freedom, and then it was given when people were deemed ready for it. One of the things that mythology relies on is a kind of picture of a homogeneous Britain in which everybody was agreed on the question of empire. Now, in fact, in all the cases of kind of post-colonial, anti-colonial resistance and post-colonial freedom, pressure was put on the British establishment. And that pressure came from resistance in the colonies, but it also came from resistance within Britain, of dissent within Britain. I mean, one of the things you have to ask is, how does Churchill go in the space of, you know, a few years from saying, I will not preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, to actually having to acquiesce in precisely that liquidation? So therefore, the story that the British establishment decided that freedom would be given is wrong. They were constantly having to engage with pressure from within and without. And my argument in the book is that although dissent around empire, particularly radical dissent around the question of empire in Britain, is a minority tradition, it is not a negligible tradition. I have talked in the book about parliamentary dissenters like Fenner Brockway and Barbara Castle, among others. And of course, if we look at an earlier period in the 20th century, people like Keir Hardie, the founder of the Labour Party, these are people who were in many ways radicalized by their contact with anti-colonial movements and anti-colonial campaigners, and brought that radicalization back to the Houses of Parliament. I mean, if you look at the debates that happen in the 19th century around India, in the early 20th century around the Meerut conspiracy case, and in the mid-20th century around Mau Mau, it's very clear that anti-colonial discourse enters the Houses of Parliament. And although there isn't a simple straight line to be drawn between that dissent and, you know, the achievement of independence, there is no doubt that anti-colonial dissent puts pressure on the British establishment. It's a minority discourse. It's not always effective in a simple, direct way, but it cannot be ignored. And I think Britain has largely ignored its own history in that regard of dissent around the question of empire.
And that's in a way odd, because, you know, Britain likes to call itself the land of the old established liberal traditions and debate and so on, but there are taboo topics. I mean, and that's exactly, and when some veneer is taken away, then you have the ugliness that we see with Brexit, but we'll come to that. I want to talk about two Indians who were, empire subjects and Indians who became part of the parliament. And if you can speak a little about that. You know, when I lived in London, I remember passing through Finsbury Town Hall, where I used to see this blue plaque for Dadabhai Nauroji, of course, being, you know, the first, what they would call black man. And in India, he would be called white because of his light skin and Parsi and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, he was a parliamentarian. And I mean, he also wrote that account of, you know, un-British economy and which is one way of un-British empire, un-British values rather. And if we move forward by a couple decades or 3 decades later, then you have Shapurji Saklatwala, a communist, believing communist. You've spoken about communism a little earlier, and how he ends up being in this discourse, and his correspondence with Gandhi. So tell us those two stories.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that the three earliest Indian MPs in Britain are of Parsi descent. So you have Nauroji, you also have Bhavnagri, who is of course a conservative and very pro-empire, but Nauroji is not. And then after Nauroji, you have Shapurji Saklatwala. Nauroji, of course, is fairly well known because, partly because he's, considered part of the Indian mainstream nationalist tradition as a kind of a forefather of the, within the Congress formation. But you're quite right that what he had to say about British rule in India, and he collaborated with Digby, who was a British economist, and between them, they created what is still not sufficiently acknowledged, a picture of the devastation, the economic devastation that India had to kind of undergo as a consequence of colonial rule, including, of course, terrible famines in the 19th century. Nauroji called it un-British rule. Now, part of what he was doing was he was appealing to the better side of British self-conceptions, that, our rule should be one of benevolence and prosperity. And he was saying, well, actually, that's not at all what British rule in India has been like. I would call it un-British rule. So he was kind of using the discourse of Britishness from within. Saklatwala is slightly different, and we don't know very much about him, and I think we should. He is a poor relation of the Tata family, right. And he's a kind of he's a maternal relation of the mainstream industrial Tatas. We don't exactly know why he comes to Britain in 1905. There is some argument that it's because of his health situation. Some argument is that he was starting to get involved in the Swadeshi movement, and his family didn't particularly want him around being political, so they packed him off to Britain. He comes to Britain, becomes a member first of the Liberals, then of the Independent Labour Party, subsequently the Labour Party. He's elected as a Labour MP the first time around. And then he becomes a communist. I believe it was in the early 1920s. And then has to leave the Labour Party when the Labour Party expels communists and distances itself from communism. But the way I write about Saklatwala is the fact that he's one of the early people to consider himself a British Indian. And he's somebody who embraces both sides of that identity very passionately. So he considers himself Indian and an anti-colonial Indian. In fact, he refers to himself as a Tilakite, rather than a communist. And then in Britain, he also, like Nauroji, uses the British we, but he uses it quite differently from Nauroji. He says, Britain is not homogeneous. I represent not the British ruling classes. I represent ordinary British people, and I want to put them in dialogue with ordinary Indian people, because ordinary Indians and ordinary British people have much more in common than the British ruling classes would have them believe. And what he tries to do is to create what he calls an international brotherhood, an anti-colonial brotherhood that would resonate both within and without Britain. And I've written extensively in the book about his speeches in Parliament, which are just absolutely remarkable because they are very, very uncompromising on the question of empire, and they're very uncompromising also on some of the compromises made by the Indian National Congress.
Tell me about his correspondence with Gandhi, because it was quite fascinating about solidarities, and because Gandhi is, of course, the story Saklatwala's name is obviously not as known as it ought to be in Britain or in India, but the story that we always hear is about Gandhi going and meeting mill workers in Lancashire and speaking that, it's not really against you, but it's about the class that you are against. But that follows, that comes later in life. But the correspondence was quite fascinating. So if you can talk about that. The correspondence
is undertaken at the end of the 1920s when Saklatwala visits India. And actually, he receives a hero's welcome. He lands in Bombay. He is immediately garlanded. There are huge rallies. He takes his garlands off, walks to the statue of Tilak and puts the garland on Tilak instead. He does this huge tour of India in 1927 or 28, or 1927 going into 1928. And at this point, he enters a correspondence with Gandhi, which is published in the Amrita Bazar Patrika. And this is an important correspondence because Saklatwala takes Gandhi very seriously. He's not dismissive of Gandhi in the way that, say, someone like M.N. Roy was. He understood that what Gandhi was doing was incredibly important in terms of bringing a kind of Indian resistance together across masses and classes. But his critique of Gandhi was that Gandhi was compromising far too much with capitalism, and that Gandhi did not see that the interests of capital and the interests of labor were often at variance, that workers' rights was not something capital was necessarily invested in. And he challenged Gandhi on this score. He also challenged Gandhi on what he saw, I think rightly, as Gandhi's own paternalism, his own tendency to, you know, in a sense, allow a worship cult to form around him. Saklatwala spoke in defense of Ambedkar and Ambedkar's criticism of Gandhi as being kind of paternalist and benevolent towards on the untouchable question, on the Dalit question. So he tried to kind of urge Gandhi to be more radical on questions of class and caste, and also to be less of an icon, to in a sense, democratize himself. And you know, Gandhi was a very clever rhetorician. He actually comes across as the winner in these debates. But I think that nonetheless, what Saklatwala had to say to Gandhi was important, and it's something that I think we should be cognizant of.
Yeah, and I speak, since you mentioned the left and communists here, I did want to ask about the international solidarity, because you speak about a lot more when you talk about the Caribbean part, and you talk about Claude McKay, and you, of course, you talk about C.L.R. James and George Padmore and folks like that. And I just wanted to know, I mean, you raised the question about how far the solidarities were possible and the kind of ties that were forged with the British left. If you can get a bit into that, because I think they talk about, I think in the prelude to the Second World War, I think you mentioned the Ethiopian conflict and all that, and you speak about colonial fascism, that, you know, to try to wrest and then try to merge those two ideas together. And from there, after that, I want to speak about a little bit of slavery. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, on the international front, it's easiest to pick up from Meerut. One of the reasons I talk about Meerut is that Meerut was not only a controversy and scandal within India. What is important about Meerut is that it became a scandal within Britain. The treatment of the prisoners, the fact that these prisoners had been jailed for no apparent reason other than a kind of a thought crime, or for the kind of the sin of organizing labor or taking part in labor rebellions. It did cause a scandal back in Britain. I think it is important to understand that that 1917 and the successful Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 absolutely galvanized anti-colonialists across the world, which is why in the 1920s and 1930s, you start to see the emergence of much more radical varieties of anti-colonialism, and much more of a sense that anti-colonialism has to be organized across nations, that people need to make alliances, international and transnational alliances, because that is something that comes out of the Bolshevik Revolution and the kind of theorizing of the importance of revolution as an international force. So Meerut becomes one of the flashpoints in which there is a fair amount of organizing within Britain itself on behalf of the prisoners. There is a very self-conscious attempt, not just in Britain, but in Europe and in America, to create radical alliances, committees for the support of the Meerut prisoners. It's an organized movement. And this is the point from which you also start to have the formation of another, another grouping we don't know very much about and ought to know more about, which is the League Against Imperialism, which is formed at the end of the 1920s. And actually Nehru was a part of the League Against Imperialism for a short while. And this was again a self-conscious attempt to bring together anti-colonial struggles in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and in South Asia together. And subsequently, I think we see echoes of this in Bandung in the 1950s, the idea that those who were colonized have a natural bond, and that should form an axis of international cooperation and solidarity. So internationalism is very important. In the book, I talk about Saklatwala on the one hand, but I think also the tremendous importance of Black radicals who were present in London, Black radicals from the Caribbean, as well as from Africa, because I think in a way, their organizing in London was more radical in some ways than the equivalent in Indian circles. Although, there were people like V.K. Menon who were incredibly important, and there's a recent book that Jairam Ramesh has done on V.K. Menon that I think is a very important contribution. Mm-hmm. But yeah, this is a picture where there is not only a question of alliances between the British left and the left in India or the left in Africa, but also Afro-Asian alliances, the importance of African and Asian colonies coming together to fight colonialism.
And I mean, you take the story forward, of course, but we know more recent examples are, of course, Rhodesia and Zimbabwe and the struggle against South Africa, and how the anti-apartheid movement, I mean, London in a way was propping up the system and benefiting from it, particularly towards the later part, in the Thatcher years, and almost reluctantly imposing certain sanctions that needed to be sanctioned. And at the same time, you had a lot of incredibly admirable British politicians, who were part of the anti-apartheid movement. And it goes on. I mean, today when we look at the whole Palestinian situation, it's similar, that you do have certain amount of radical support. So that's a point very well made. I wanted to go back to the whole notion of a benevolent and benign Commonwealth, because, in a way, you cannot disaggregate class from race here. And is one thing that's an undercurrent in your book. And here's how I would put it, that if we were to look at slavery as a manifestation of that, and I mean, Britain loves to take credit about, Wilberforce and all of that, and how we were the first to get rid of it. And, this movement about getting rid of the Clive statue, someone said that we should have Wilberforce there instead, of that, and which was a nice idea. I mean, I'd mentioned Dadabhai Nauroji, and somebody else mentioned, yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of interesting ideas coming, who could be there instead, I mean, I'm not suggesting it should be Gandhi or Mandela by any means, but there is that part to it, which becomes interesting. But whether we look at what we used to call the Girmitia pattern, the indentured labor that followed, which was a way of contractualizing the same relationship later in Caribbean, in Fiji, in Southeast Asia. And then where I want to bring us to, because that takes us to the politics of today in Britain, the Windrush story, where Amelia Gentleman has written this amazing book based on her reporting, how cruelly and pitilessly Britain in the last few years has treated people who had come assuming they were British, stripping away of their identity and sending them back to the Caribbean. So if you can, and all of that is interlinked very closely with the politics of Britain today and what's happening with Brexit. So if you can reflect on that, and is it an unwillingness to listen and learn? Is it the fault of the history books in Britain? Is it the prevailing narrative that the class wants to, and is there, I'm sure we know that there are people who oppose that narrative. Are they in a minority? What's preventing Britain the reckoning?
Okay, I mean, I think that, one thing is that in relation to the question of immigration and the question of citizenship, it is very clear that Britain has never come to terms with the contradiction at the heart of the empire, right? That up until about 1947 and in fact well into the 1960s, many peoples in Africa and Asia were British subjects, right? So you have spent 300 years or more, telling people you are British subjects. When those subjects in turn make claims upon Britain, that is when you start to have all the various immigration legislation, right? Starting from the 1940s, late 1940s onwards, to suddenly say, actually, no, you don't have the rights of British subjects. And we have a series of immigration acts, which are, in a sense, an attempt to dial back on the history of empire. So on the one hand, say, here's this wonderful commonwealth, the queen is the head of this large family, we are all happy, and we are all part of the wider British family, but you don't have the rights of citizens, okay? So Windrush has to be situated precisely in that scandal of empire, which is, on the one hand, you have told people for generations that you are not just British in a political sense, but we have also given you British values. You also then bring people, and this is specific to Windrush, you bring people into Britain in the 1950s and 1960s because you have a labor shortage, you invite them in, and then now that you're playing race against class, you suddenly decide that that they're not citizens, right? So this is only possible if you have a deliberate omission of the history of empire, not just in the schools or teaching, which of course there clearly is, but also in political discourse. All of a sudden you pretend that empire didn't happen, that you didn't really, say that people in the West Indies were British subjects, or you didn't really ask them to come here and work as, fill the labor shortages. So I think there's a great deal of lying and selective mythologizing around empire. Empire in Britain is a movable feast, right? So politicians can go in one breath from saying, oh, we must all be proud of empire. It was such a wonderful thing. It has all brought us together in the commonwealth of families. In the very next breath saying, it was all in the past, stop talking about it, right? So this is weird thing where you're supposed to take pride in it, but also absolutely refuse to apologize. And so I think that Windrush is a good example of a kind of, very, very selective remembering of empire, as well as a kind of great deal of, contradictory misuse of the history of empire.
No, that's a very good phrase, selective remembering, because that's at the heart of this. I have a related, just an observation, we talk about permanent residency in a country, and everyone says that I'm a permanent resident in England, or Britain. But we all know that the term they use is a very, very loaded term. It's called indefinite leave to remain. It's a privilege and not a right. And I think it manifested, now things have changed because of the situation in Hong Kong. But I remember in 1997, when the handover took place, and I was a reporter in Hong Kong at that time, I remember there was a talk of, the British overseas national citizens, BNOs as they were called, whether they would be able to have the right to abode. And Britain was incredibly reluctant. And I remember there were people who said that, if only they did, if only they were allowed in, they would have probably rejuvenated the economy, because Hong Kong entrepreneurism, and there was a construct which was political in that too, because they would all probably have been conservative voters, in theory, is the way it was being constructed. But no, it was not being done. So I think there is that reluctance, and now it is being changing again for a patently political reason. So I do think that race is a very important element, which is what brings me to the Black Lives Matter movement. And there's an enormous resistance, not just in Britain, even here in the US. I live in Brooklyn, and there's a store in which has put up a banner saying Black Lives Matter, and obviously maskless Trump supporter, no doubt, comes there without the mask and starts shouting all lives matter, all lives matter. And you had an incredibly unpleasant experience recently over that, when after the George Floyd protests, and when the football players decided to take the knee at the Old Trafford, some guy went up with a banner saying all lives matter, and you had a very succinct and pithy point about that, about what you actually meant. It was misconstrued, and we don't really want to get into the contour, but tell me, why is it that Black Lives Matter is such a potent slogan around the world today?
Well, I think Black Lives Matter is potent because really what it's saying is that until Black Lives Matter, all lives don't matter, right? So there is no point in pronouncing all lives matter, because in any society, some lives manifestly matter more than others. So in America, we have seen this time and again, Black lives don't matter as much as white lives. And that is, true in Britain as well. And again, without revisiting the controversy, what I wanted to say was that those groups who do not have equality of value, those are the names that we need to take, right? There is no point in saying that the lives of the dominant and the privileged matter. They do matter. That's already a fact. So there is no need to say that. Today we say Black lives matter in contexts like the US and Britain, because Black lives don't matter. Shouting that all lives matter is simply an untruth, because as things stand, all lives don't matter. So in any context, and I did try to explain this, that in the equivalent in India, when it comes to caste, it is important to say Dalit lives matter, because we are not yet in a situation where Dalit lives are given the same kind of value. So such a phrase only makes sense in relation to a group who are marginalized, whose lives are treated as not mattering. So therefore saying white lives matter and all lives matter, at best it's disingenuous, and at worst it's racist, because it's actually trying to deny the claims made by Black people to equality. And this is a good moment to say that the book talks about the fact that from the very day that slavery began, slaves resisted their condition. Slaves were always saying Black lives matter. And this is one reason I would slightly oppose replacing Colston with Wilberforce, because part of what I'm trying to say in the book is ordinary people, whether in India or whether in the West Indies, whether they were colonial subjects or whether they were slaves, ordinary people had a role to play in the story of freedom. And there's a way in which I would say, well, if we are going to put another statue, then it should be to the unknown slave rebel.
Right.
Because slaves did rebel. We don't know their names. They are lost to history. I mean, Black lives didn't matter to the point where Black lives were just thrown overboard from slave ships. Even the name was not noted down. They were just merchandise and they were thrown. So I think that in a way, maybe bringing Black Lives Matter together with a kind of a homage to the unknown slave, I think that might be a more significant kind of a point to make in the context of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, and it's a very powerful symbol, because we do honor unknown soldiers, so why not unknown soldiers? Absolutely. Unquestionable. I mean, we don't equate every martyred soldier in one individual by the name, but it's a collective, and so that's a very strong point indeed. I want to pick on one of the more unpleasant aspects within India too, which is that a lot of Indians are very prompt to say that yes, Black Lives Matter, particularly in the progressive circles and all that, but never examine how they look at the relationship that India has with the Black community, which visits India as students from Africa, whether it is in Pune or Delhi or Mumbai, or people who end up living in India because, they have chosen to do that. And, I mean, I do know people from Africa and the Caribbean world who are Black, who have had incredibly unpleasant experiences, the life they've lived in India. And at the same time, the rhetoric of the government is, of course, that, Bandung spirit and non-alignment and Afro-Asian solidarity. So there is, of course, an elite-driven hypocrisy there. And what is at the base of it? I mean, its color is certainly, but it's ultimately it comes to Varna and caste, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot of things. I mean, let me talk about two. One is that, I have written in the book about how Britain has forgotten both the history of the empire and its own history of dissent around empire. But, the fact is that in India, we too have forgotten the history of empire and the history of India's very varied resistance to empire. I don't think if you ask a young 22-year-old Indian on the street about Bandung or Afro-Asian solidarity, they will know very much. It's not something that is really part of Indian political DNA, the fact that there was this kind of little moment in history where we weren't always just looking to the West, but that in fact there was an attempt to create horizontal alliances across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, and of course Latin America. That is a moment not only that we have lost, but we are actually being encouraged to forget it. Partly because of, in a sense, the pushing aside of Nehru's legacies in India. So I think that we too in India have forgotten the history of empire and anti-colonialism. I think that you're quite right that colorism is a big part of it. And here is where we need to also think about this, that empire damaged those it colonized for generations in Africa and in India. And I think it is not extreme to say that in many ways we have internalized empire's hierarchies, we have internalized imperial discourse, and that we still continue to operate with the state structures, the political institutions, and the habits of thought that empire left behind. So I would say that is, we still exist in a world with whites at the top and Black people somewhere at the bottom, and we need to be questioning those hierarchies. But as you point out, race hierarchies, both in the colonial period and today, slot very neatly into caste hierarchies. I mean, it's no accident that the British, by and large, worked with the upper castes and Brahmins in setting up, Indian jurisprudence and Indian political institutions. That they always looked in Africa. They looked for chiefs, and they worked with people they considered to be at the top of the social hierarchy. And I think we have yet to really undo some of that damage.
The book that I'm looking forward to is by this author whose first name I forget, but her surname is Wilkerson. She's a Black American Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and author. And she calls it caste and how the nations are divided. And she writes about Nazi Germany, India, and America. And it's out in a week or so. So I'm quite
okay.
It will be quite interesting. She also wrote the book, the Warmth of the Darker Sun. I think that was the title, about the Blacks who left the slave states in America to move to the north, and the movement which started in 1870s and up to 1950s, and how that transformed northern societies. And so I'm quite looking forward to that, and it's kind of trying to bridge these things together. We are 8 minutes short of the hour, and I know we have more time, and there are about 5 questions. I'm going to go to the questions first, and then we can continue as things go. But one question is from Kirit Yagnik here, which says, do you have any comments on the role of Shyamji Krishna Verma and the India freedom fighters connected to the India House?
So Krishna Verma is somebody who was quite influential for a short period of time in Britain, because he ends up having to leave and he ends up having to go to Paris in exile. And in the book, I've talked at some length about Richard Congreve, who Krishna Verma was himself very interested in. And I've talked a little bit about the influence of India House. But in a sense, India House gets shut down after the murder of Madan Lal Dhingra, and those kind of more radical figures associated with India House end up leaving Britain. So it is not except for a very short period, it is not a significant influence on dissent within Britain.
Right. The next question is from Shankar Padmanabhan, which is a very interesting one, and talks about the tribal rebellions of India, that even tribal rebellions in India against the British Empire, like Birsa Munda, or revolt by local chieftains in the south or other areas, are still not known to many people in India. Do you think that such movements have been largely not studied in detail or forgotten deliberately and are not part of the freedom narrative?
I think, and this is what I began by saying to your first question, Salil, that the picture that we get of the freedom movement in India has been largely very selective. And it is like any other story. It is an official story, which has largely focused on well-known figures who then inherited the reins of government. There is no doubt that both kind of caste rebellions, Ambedkar's role, tribal rebellions, Birsa Munda being just one name, that these have been consigned to the margins of the story. And this does have consequences for how India is today, because I think we have not sufficiently acknowledged the role of those who are not part of that official selective mainstream narrative. And it does mean that, and I think this should be relatively uncontroversial, that we still don't really look upon Adivasis as agents. We don't look upon them as people who have political agency and who are part of a very heterogeneous and complicated history of the region, widely construed.
The next question is from Salil Tripathi, which is, what's the best way to describe the internal colonialism in India today, whether it's Kashmir, Assam, or elsewhere? Is it with the old terms such as comprador bourgeoisie? And in our analysis, how far should we de-link the government policies in India today with the other big powers today?
So I don't understand that last bit. Can you just say that again?
Yeah. In our analysis, how far should we de-link government policies in India today with those of the other big powers today?
Okay. Look, I'm going to give a general answer. My view is that post-colonial entities, and that includes India, have not sufficiently decolonized. And I said this in relation to something Salil asked earlier, which is to say that we have taken on too much of what colonialism left behind in terms of ideologies, in terms of state structures, in terms of military operations, in terms of how we see races, classes, groups of people. And so what I would say is that there has largely been a failure in India, along with other countries, to decolonize sufficiently. I do think that it is extraordinary that in the 21st century, we are still using sedition legislation that was used against Indian freedom fighters, and that we are subjecting people to the kinds of suppression and repression that the British used against those who resisted them in India. So I wouldn't myself use a term like comprador bourgeoisie, partly just because it is now so laden with a kind of a particular both Latin American and Marxist history. This isn't to say that it isn't valuable. No form of colonialism survived without collaborators, whether that was in Kenya or whether that was in Nigeria or whether that was in India. So the idea of collaboration, I think, is incredibly important. It's the term I tend to use rather than comprador bourgeoisie. But I think that since we are having this discussion in an Indian context, I think Indians must ask themselves, beyond nationalism, which is also a Western invention, by the way, the nationalism and nations as we know it are a Western European concept. What should we really do in order to decolonize? And it isn't sufficient to say, well, we should recover, for instance, Hindu identity and embrace Hindu nationalism. There is nothing Indian about Hindu nationalism. It's again a very Western idea that countries should cohere around a single religion or a single language, and that is what the national identity should be. But I think we have to ask ourselves, what would it mean to truly decolonize, and for the Indian state to actually be a decolonized entity, which it currently, I'm afraid, is not.
Yeah, it brings back that old idea of overnight brown people turning white, and I think we have remained there. And when you earlier talked about elite seeking certain rights and freedoms from the British in the colonial time. It also reminded me that, everyone calls Magna Carta the starting point of human rights in 1215, but it was basically a bunch of rich white people who didn't want to pay taxes to finance a war. I mean, it was not about seeking voting rights for everybody by any means. I mean, it was a great achievement to stop a war, but it was completely driven by elite-driven financial priority. You spoke about how it applies to India, and there's a very good question from Jaya Nair here, which ties in a lot of points that we've been making this hour. That what are your thoughts on the role of socialism in the struggle against colonial rule worldwide, considering that empires are fundamentally capitalistic? And it is India's success against Britain under Gandhi, perhaps. He was a closet capitalist. In fact, he was backed by many capitalists, Birlas, of course, but a lot of Gujarati Sarabhais and all of them were big supporters of Gandhi. The ashram survived because of support from Indian capitalists. Is it more of a loss of power from Britain across the country? So the question is India's success against Britain under Gandhi more a loss of power from Britain across the country? And what role does socialism have to play, given that imperialism is such a capitalist construct?
I'm glad that point was brought up, because one of the things that I think has happened in recent years, but maybe longer, is that both in Britain and in the former colonies, too often colonialism is seen as a cultural phenomenon, right? So it was basically about imposing English or imposing the railways, and if we just speak another language, then we become decolonized. And one of the things I find myself explaining to my students here is that there would have been no colonialism without capitalism, and there certainly would not have been capitalism without slavery. The Indian Raj comes later on in the story, but actually the Industrial Revolution and capitalism in Britain and in Europe was very dependent on extracting unfree labor from millions of trafficked Africans. That's what allowed the money, which, where does capitalism find capital in the first instance? It found it from free labor. It found it from the fact that it extracted labor from people without reimbursing them in any way or at any point, which is why the call for reparations now, I think, is very, very important. But the point is, yes, I think it is exactly right to say that you cannot have a critique of colonialism that isn't also a critique of capitalism. And this is much more clear if you look at the anti-colonial writings and movements coming out of the Caribbean and Africa. People in the Caribbean, people like C.L.R. James and George Padmore, who I write about, were much more explicit in saying that colonialism is about capitalism, and in order for us to be truly anti-colonial, we must also be anti-capitalist. That is exactly the substance of Saklatwala's engagement with Gandhi. Saklatwala saying, this isn't just about, changing the forms of worship or changing how we dress or, changing how we do things more. It is about capitalism. It is about the fundamental opposition of labor and capital. Gandhi disagreed. Now, Gandhi, I'm not a Gandhi scholar. In fact, Salil knows more about Gandhi than I do. Gandhi was certainly, I think, soft on capitalism. He had interesting ideas. I mean, his hatred of machinery, for instance, which also people like Saklatwala found very problematic, didn't necessarily tie very well into how capital saw the future of India. It certainly didn't mesh well with how Nehru saw the future of India, which was all about big machinery and advanced technology and so on. So Gandhi wasn't, I would say, I don't think he was a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist or a closet capitalist, but he was certainly not willing to openly criticize capitalism. And he wanted to sort of, in a sense, create a kind of false unity between labor and capital. And he didn't like strikes. He didn't like labor organizing. But yes, and you see this much more in the case of the African and West Indian anti-colonialists who are much more clear that anti-colonialism means anti-capitalism.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we can have a long discussion on Gandhi another time, but I'm also conscious of the time, and we have about 10, 15 minutes maybe with that. I see 3 open questions, so I'll certainly deal with those. One is from Mohan Rao, who basically asked, yeah, he says, I was fascinated to read about Cunard and her revolutionary contributions. How do you explain someone like her? I can't unpack the question, only you can probably, yeah.
Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Nancy Cunard. Nancy Cunard is, in a way, like Saklatwala. She is from a wealthy family. She's not herself wealthy, and in fact, she is disinherited, but she comes from an aristocratic British family. Some of you may remember the Cunard shipping lines. So she belongs to that family. But she very early on becomes part of an artistic avant-garde, a milieu of poets and writers and thinkers. And she, I talk about in the book as somebody who breaks from her family. She has a very bitter break with her mother, who is an aristocrat, Lady Emerald Cunard. And she becomes an ally to Black anti-colonial campaigners who are based in London in the 1930s. And she emerges as a very, what's the word I would use? A very reliable and sharp-tongued ally of anti-colonialism in Britain. She spends time also, of course, in Paris. She spends a lot of time using the cultural capital that she has as a white woman with aristocratic connections to showcase the work of Black writers and Black political thinkers across the globe. So she puts together this amazing anthology called Negro. And the whole point of that anthology is to say, you know, we need to be listening to Black people. Black voices matter. And she puts together this incredible anthology that I think is, you know, in fact, all the more relevant in the context of Black Lives Matter, where you have people from Latin America, Black people from America, from obviously the African continent, from the West Indies, doing a variety of things from poetry, short stories, and artworks to political writings and ethnographies. And she is, I think Mohan's question is, how do we describe somebody who is, I think today would be referred to as a white ally, right? So how do we account for white allies? And what I would say is 2 things. One, we do all have the capacity to dissent from the formations which made us. It's a very important capacity that we all have. We may grow up in a particular context, we may be given a certain set of ideas, but human beings across the world have the capacity to reflect on their formation and secede from that formation. My infamous abolish whiteness tweet was exactly saying that. The fact that you're white or the fact that you're a Brahmin doesn't mean that you are beholden to those dominant ideologies. You can be a caste traitor or a race traitor or a class traitor, and you can decide to think differently, to act differently, to behave differently. And I think if I get Mohan's question right, it is the question of how does one learn to dissent from the formations that made us? Nancy Cunard learned partly because she was a natural rebel, partly because she set out to learn from the people who were at the receiving end of white supremacy, Black people across the world, but also specifically Black people in Britain and in Europe. And that is something, whatever formation that we come from, we can also set out to do, to say, I will learn from Dalits in India. I don't know everything. Yep. It is important for me to understand what it is to be at the receiving end of caste supremacy, just as it was important for Cunard to understand what it was like to be at the receiving end of white supremacy.
No, and absolutely. And the thing that we hear about, when the people who say that I don't know what my caste is are typically those who are in that privileged position to say so. And it's not the same comparison as Kunal, but one of the Sarabhai sisters is a good story like that too, that, she sided with the workers in a strike against the mill that her brother ran. And there's a very nice episode in the Ahmedabad history of the 1920s and 30s. So yeah, I've three more questions I think we can quickly run through. One is from Shrikant Gururaj, which is about the black on black slavery, the slavery that was present in Africa, separate from white, colonial initiated slavery, the transatlantic trade, with various kinds of black on black slavery and servitude that thrives even today in some forms. And it's not just that, I mean, the whole Indian bonded labor system is part of that, So if you can. That.
I tend to raise my eyebrows when black on black is raised, because it's certainly in the British context, it's a way of saying what about, okay? Now, there are two things to say. Yes, there were black tribes who had slaves, and as Salil points out, we still have slavery in parts of India. Slavery is not unique to Britain, but there is a difference between slavery as part of a wider social system. I'm not saying it's good, and the scale, the sheer scale, brutal, planned scale on which industrial British and European slavery took place. We are talking about millions of people trafficked from their homelands, taken to another island, places that they had not been to, and then made to work if they survived that journey, which thousands and thousands did not survive. If they survived that journey, they had to work for the rest of their short or long lives in miserable conditions. There is no comparison between slaves held by African chieftains, and I'm not an expert on African social structure, and the scale on which transatlantic slavery took place. This question, certainly in the British context, is usually asked in bad faith, as though there was always slavery and there was nothing particularly new or different about transatlantic slavery. There was something new and different and absolutely horrific in both scale and content in transatlantic slavery. And whatever India went through under the British Raj, there is no comparison to what the Middle Passage and transatlantic and what the Black communities of the Caribbean have had to endure. So if we feel a little bit nationalist about India in relation to the Raj, what happened to the Black peoples of parts of Africa who were trafficked to the Caribbean is 1,000 times worse.
Right. Two more quick questions. One is from Anusha, and you've touched upon it a little bit, but you might want to reflect on it because she takes the question forward. This is Anusha Prakash. What are your thoughts on the citizenship offered to the Hong Kong citizens? Do you believe, and this is we've dealt with that, but the second part is more interesting. Do you believe this could result in a repetition of what has happened to the West Indian and African citizens? Do you think there might, I think what she's getting at is whether there will be a Windrush equivalent some years down from now when the grandson of Boris is a prime minister or something like that.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, the fact in Britain is this. If you're not white and preferably English, your citizenship is always in question. I mean, we have the case of the controversial case of Shamima Begum, who was born here, right? So she was born here. She has natal citizenship rights, and citizenship was stripped from her, and she was told, go to Bangladesh. And Bangladesh naturally said she has nothing to do with us, which she doesn't. But she was born to Bangladeshi parents. So nobody who is not, in a sense, quote unquote, what they like to call indigenous British, by which they mean white British, nobody's citizenship is secure, no matter how long you've been here, no matter how long your parents have been here. So absolutely, right now it's a nice game to play, to say, well, yes, you know, Mother Britain will receive those in Hong Kong at the receiving end of China. That said, I am not sympathetic to China in Hong Kong. I am not sympathetic to what China, the Chinese state, is doing. I know young people in Hong Kong who pushing against the Chinese state, but also are under no illusion about the British state. I have one who is coming to study with me at Cambridge next year. Right now, asking for British citizenship is a strategic move against the Chinese state. It by no means protects them in the long run from the vagaries and the caprice of the British state. So what happens remains to be seen. But here, I think a lot of people are caught between two colonialisms, frankly. That of the Chinese state and that of the superseded British Empire.
And Shrikant Gururaju asked the black on black question. Thanks you for hitting the nail on the head by reminding us of the sheer scale and ruthless efficiency of the transatlantic slave trade versus the other instances. So he takes your point. I just thought I should mention that too. And when you mentioned this citizenship, I always am reminded of the book that my friend Robert Winder wrote called Bloody Foreigners.
Yeah. Yeah.
That last chapter he actually talks about how the whole notion of English purity is itself a joke. And I have a friend who's white and British. His mother is Norwegian and father is English. And he always supports the Norwegian football team when he plays England. And he always looked at me with great pity and he says, you know what, no one ever tells me to pass the Tebet test, but if you cheer India, you know, you have hell to pay. But if I cheer Norway against England, no one bats an eyelid, and which also goes into the heart of this story, absolutely. The final question is from Dhruv Janaki, which is a very, very interesting question, takes us into a new arena. That parks and wildlife sanctuaries in South Asia are the colonial relic, but witness powerful anti-colonial struggles. How can post-colonial scholars and political ecologists engage with these histories and resist bourgeois environmentalist narratives? And I think it might be, I mean, it's worth reflecting on the new environmental impact assessment laws that are being passed in India now, which are, you know, reducing some of the consent ideas that go with it. And I think it ties in with the tribal rebellion that you were talking about, yeah.
So I'm not particularly an environmental or ecological scholar. I think, as Salil suggests, in relation to kind of tribal and in fact peasant movements in India, tribal as well as other groups who defended land and land rights. Certainly it's true in Kenya, perhaps more explicitly than in India, that the struggle was around land and land usage and land rights. I think that in a sense, the question answers itself. Their anti-colonialism was never, again, a homogeneous picture. There were radical democratic forms of anti-colonialism, and there were forms of anti-colonialism which people like Frantz Fanon warned about, and in fact Gandhi also in his very early days warned about, which is to say you simply transfer power from white rulers to their equivalent brown rulers, right? Gandhi in was it, I think 1915 says that there's no point in getting rid of British princes only to be crushed by the heel of Indian princes. And Fanon and others are of course much more explicit in saying there's no point in national freedom or national independence if all you're going to do is to hand the levers of power to the bourgeoisie in Africa. I think the broad answer to your question, and I'm sure there are people who know more about environmental struggles than I do, is that we need to be recuperating the spirit of democratic and radical anti-colonialism, which was often not voiced as a struggle for nation. Often those struggles were specific struggles around forests, around the enclosure of the commons, around land use, around livelihood. And it's very, very explicit when you look at Jamaica in 1865 or Kenya in the 1940s, that it is about how to use land, who gets to use land. I mean, in Kenya, for instance, the substance of the land and freedom movement was actually about retrieving land for communal usage, as opposed to the British idea that huge tracts of land could be owned by a single aristocrat, as opposed to the idea that land was something to be privatized. So I think the broad, perhaps unsatisfactory answer to your question is that the spirit of indigenous rebellions, the spirit of democratic peasant rebellions as in Kenya is what we need to be harnessing and thinking about in relation to decolonization, rather than simply in nationalist terms. I think nationalism made it very easy for the bourgeoisie to simply say, okay, now we're in charge, and we'll have the privileges, thank you very much. Whereas actually democratic struggles against the Raj or against the British Empire were often about very specific things like labor rights or land usage. And that is what we need to be bringing back. And I would say that today, some of the struggles within India or within the borders of the nation state perhaps are demonstrating the spirit of those struggles more than what the state itself is doing in relation to anti-colonialism.
So one final question, wrap up soon, but one final question is looking ahead. Black Lives Matter is obviously changing political discourse. Is this the moment that you do you feel optimistic? Do you feel positive that all this will lead to the kind of re-examining our histories, re-examining our privileges, re-examining our constructs and narratives that we have taken for granted? And or will it be, will we be having similar discussions a few years from now?
I think the answer, Salil, is both. I think certainly where I sit, which is a relatively privileged university position, I am seeing discourse shift. I am seeing a greater willingness, certainly in some quarters, to talk about race, to talk about the history of empire, to talk about racism. That said, I think that people who want to talk about race equality or caste equality or labor rights or the rights of people in Kashmir, they are up against the workings of power. And power, whether in Trump's America or in India today or in Brexit Britain, does have the tendency to be fairly ruthless. And I am not sanguine about what may happen to dissenters in Trump's America any more than I am sanguine about what is happening to dissenters in India today. I do think that far too many, that there is a great price increasingly to be paid for speaking up, and in Britain as well. And I would not want to say, well, more Black people or more Dalits should die so that we can all change. I do think that we are asking people to pay a very huge price for revisiting things that we should have actually, frankly, understood and practiced a long time ago. So I'm a combination of very glad that these discussions are happening. I very much hope that there will be equivalent discussions in India, that we should have a Dalit Lives Matter movement led by Dalits, and we should be listening to what they have to tell us about what it means to be Dalit or not upper caste in India today. But I think it is impossible for anyone who is sentient not to be aware of the price that people are having to pay for doing these things.
And I think it's linked to the privilege part. And we do have 7 minutes, and one question has just snuck in. And I think it might be very briefly to reflect on it. This is from Deepankar Khasnabish, that a significant amount of anti-British agitation during the colonial times happened from outside India. That is missing today. The NRI community, of which you and I are in a way a part, is mostly trying to either be neutral or supporting a retrograde mindset. I think what he has in mind is this enthusiasm that overseas Indians have for the new India, if one were to call that, yeah. And this community with its resources is a dismay and a bad news. That's a comment, but the question is, how can this be changed? I suppose by talking, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a good, we haven't talked about the Gadar movement. The Gadar movement is, of course, the most, it's not the only, but it's the most significant part of anti-colonial resistance outside India. You also have people like Virendranath Chattopadhyay, who are based in Europe. You, of course, have Shyamji Krishnavarma, who someone raised earlier. Of course, part of the ironic reason that these people were operating in Europe and in America is that sedition laws made it impossible in India or in the Caribbean, in the case of anti-colonial black campaigners, right? So you could articulate a critique of empire in London in a way that you could not do in Delhi or in Nairobi. So yes, the presence of dissidents in anti-colonial struggles is absolutely important, and I'm glad that it was brought up. But I think that, you know, we can't make a simple comparison between the dissidents of the early 20th century and NRIs now, partly because we're looking at very different class formations, right? So we are looking, particularly in the case of America, at people who went to America as kind of skilled, already middle class, already educated, and frankly, already upper caste immigrants, right? So I have relatives in America. All of us probably have relatives in America. And in Britain, the class profile was a little bit different, of course, for many years. But the NRI community today, the Indian NRI community, is largely successful. Not always, but largely successful, largely wealthy, and overwhelmingly Hindu and upper caste. And now that there isn't an anti-colonial nationalist struggle happening, their allegiances are with the Indian state. But something else has happened that is important. Because they are often, despite their successes, at the receiving end of white racism, there is something very attractive about religious identity, a religious identity tied up with a national identity for the diaspora. So I have seen this in generation after generation of students. When faced with white racism, the idea that there is an eternal India that is eternally Hindu and that is tied up to the Vedas or, you know, whatever text, or the Gita or whatever, allows a kind of crutch in the face of another form of supremacism. And the fact is, you can't fight supremacism by supremacism, because ultimately all supremacisms are cut from the same cloth. So that leads us to the second half of your question. You know, what can be done? Well, as Salil says, we are talking. The map of Indian NRIdom is also varied. It is not uniformly you know, political in one form or the other, although it is overwhelmingly in the way that Salil described. I had a phone call the other day from somebody who I don't think is who's not an academic, who's not a particularly political activist, and she rang me up and she said, you know, there are several of us, about 100 of us, who are very worried about what is happening in India today. We want to organize within the British Indian community. We would like your help and advice on this. So I do think, again, that there are pockets of dissidence, and as happened in the anti-colonial period, perhaps that is all that can happen now. I think dissidents have to identify each other and make alliances both within and outside India and kind of gather strength. But dissidence is always a difficult task, and very often you are a minority and you kind of have to struggle as a minority in the face of far more powerful forces with far more resources to hand. But I think we just have to keep believing in the power of critical thought and dissent.
And it's being against the tide, which you've been doing brilliantly, and more power to you. Speaking truth to power is always difficult. It's not easy. You've been doing it, and keep at it. And we must.
And you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Raghu, I turn to you now.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Priya and Salil, for an amazing information and insight-packed session. Thank you. And thank you, audiences, for joining us this evening.
Thank you.